I always knew there was something off about Gary. Ever since he moved in with my mom and me, something just didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way he always seemed to avoid eye contact or how he'd disappear on certain nights, coming back with vague excuses about work or late-night walks. I figured he was just weird or didn't like me, but I never imagined the truth could be this horrifying. I'm Jake, by the way. I'm 18, just graduated high school, and was trying to figure out my next steps in life until everything changed, until I found out what Gary really is. It was last week when I started to put the pieces together. The full moon had just passed and I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my mom crying in the living room. Her sobs were quiet, muffled, but I could hear them through the thin walls of our house. I slipped out of bed and crept down the hall. I saw Gary standing over her, his back to me, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Shh, babe, it's okay," he was saying in this deep, raspy voice that made my skin crawl. "It won't happen again. You know I can't control it." Control what? Before I could figure out what was happening, Gary turned slightly, his eyes catching mine. They were glowing, not in the way someone's eyes catch the light, but actually glowing, this eerie yellow like a predator in the dark. My blood ran cold. I backed away, retreating to my room as silently as I could, heart pounding so loud I thought he might hear it. That was the first time I realized Gary was more than just a jerk. There was something wrong with him. The next morning I tried to act normal, but every time I looked at Gary, my stomach twisted. I couldn't get those glowing eyes out of my head. Mom seemed distant too. She wouldn't look me in the eye, and when I asked her if everything was okay, she just brushed me off. "You don't have to worry about it, Jake," she said, her voice shaky. "It's complicated." But I couldn't let it go. I started paying closer attention to Gary, noticing things I'd ignored before. His weirdly enhanced sense of smell. He'd sniff the air when he walked into a room, like he was tracking something. His habit of disappearing around the same time every month. And then there were the injuries, scratches and bruises he couldn't explain. I had to know the truth. That night I stayed up late waiting for him to leave. Sure enough, just after midnight, Gary grabbed his jacket and slipped out the back door. I followed him, keeping my distance, my breath fogging in the cool night air. He headed toward the woods behind our house, his movements unnaturally smooth, almost animalistic. I don't know what I expected to find, but what I saw that night shattered any sense of normalcy I had left. I kept low, hiding behind trees as Gary entered a clearing. He started to shake, his body convulsing in this grotesque, unnatural way. I watched paralyzed as his form twisted, bones cracking loudly in the stillness of the forest. His limbs elongated, his muscles rippled, and his face stretched into a monstrous snout. Gary wasn't human. He was a werewolf. I must have made a noise because suddenly his head snapped toward me. His glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I knew I was screwed. Without thinking, I bolted, crashing through the underbrush, my heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, I could hear it, crashing through the trees, snarling. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, this guttural, primal growl that echoed through the forest. I managed to make it home, barely. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my hands shaking. I pressed my back against it, trying to catch my breath, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Gary, the thing, was out there, and it knew I had seen it. The next morning, Gary acted like nothing had happened. He sat at the breakfast table calmly sipping his coffee, reading the paper like he wasn't a literal monster. My mom was there too, but she looked even more fragile than before, her eyes darting between us as if she knew something terrible was coming. I had to confront her. I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. Not after what I'd seen. "Mom," I said, my voice low, "we need to talk." She looked up at me, her face pale. "Jake, please, just leave it alone." "How can I leave it alone? He's a freaking werewolf, and you knew, didn't you?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and she nodded. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she whispered. "Gary, he's been trying to control it. He never meant for you to know." "Control it? Are you kidding me? He's a monster," I shouted, my fear boiling over into anger. Gary walked into the room, his eyes narrowing at me. "You don't understand, kid. It's not something I asked for." I backed away, my heart racing. "You're dangerous." "I keep it under control," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Most of the time." But he didn't. That night, I heard the screams. I woke up to my mom's terrified voice. Rushing down the stairs, I found her in the living room pinned beneath Gary, his face half transformed, teeth elongating, his body trembling as he fought the change. His eyes were wild, desperate. "Get out of here, Jake!" my mom screamed, her voice filled with terror. But I couldn't just leave her. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a fire poker, and swung it at Gary's back. It made contact with a sickening thud and he let out a deafening howl, spinning around to face me. For a moment I thought I was dead, but then something strange happened. Gary backed away, his body convulsing like he was fighting the transformation. His human side was still in there, struggling for control. "Jake, run!" he choked out, his voice barely human anymore. I grabbed my mom and pulled her toward the door, my hands shaking. We barely made it out before Gary lost the battle with himself. As we stumbled into the night, we heard the sound of bones snapping, flesh tearing, and then the howl. Now we're on the run. My mom, me, and the knowledge that my stepfather is a creature out of a nightmare. I don't know if we'll ever be safe. Gary's out there, hunting, and no matter how far we run, I can still hear that haunting sound, the howl that chills me to the bone. Because Gary isn't just a werewolf. He's coming for us. And I know deep down that this isn't over. Not until one of us is dead.